This episode, I'm joined by Tim Themi and Adam Lovasz to discuss the work of Georges Bataille. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. If you'd like to support the podcast and keep it running, as it runs off donations alone, then please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So I'm joined by Tim Themi and Adam Lovasz, and we are going to be discussing the work of Georges Bataille, primarily from a Hungarian monograph, which is soon to be translated into English, the focus of which is basically why we should read Bataille today, why he's still relevant, and it takes the work, as Adam was telling me beforehand, takes the work of Bataille seriously, which is sort of an odd thing to say, but often you find Bataille in peculiar places, and you don't always find him sort of in, I guess, so-called serious places. Before we begin, Adam, of course, you've been on the show before, but Tim, tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is you do.
Thanks, James. Thanks for having me, and thanks, Adam, for teeing this up. It's a privilege to be here. Myself, I have a background in philosophy and psychoanalysis, and before that, I had a background in the positive sciences. So it was an engineering degree. Then there was a PhD in philosophy, which specialized on Lacan. And since then, I've been teaching here and there and writing articles and writing books, all the fun stuff.
Mm-hmm. Now, we should emphasize you've written a book on Lacan and Bataille, correct?
I have. I've written one on Lacan and Nietzsche. That was a conversion of my thesis in 2014, and I followed it up with one on Lacan and Bataille just over a year ago.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'm sure your book will, probably come back in along with Nietzsche and probably a bit of Lacan as well. But Adam, you've been on the show before, so unfortunately you don't get to answer this question. But we'll get to you soon, and I'm sure you'll comment on the room. But Tim, your first time here, so the Hermitix question, you could place three thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick? And Georges Bataille, who I have said on this podcast before is one of the few philosophers who actually scares me, is already in the room. And then you can add three more. So who do you pick?
Well, the three more will be probably even scarier in their own way. In a chronological order, that would be Nietzsche, Freud, Bataille, and Lacan. So Nietzsche and Freud as the German wing, then Bataille and Lacan as the French wing. And the reason is because there's a connection between Nietzsche and Freud, and that Nietzsche anticipates much in Freud, or if you're a skeptic, you'll say Freud borrows much from Nietzsche, only sort of admitting to parts of it. But concepts like the unconscious, repression, ideals and morality as a symptom of a defensive, like, distortion of repressed drives projected. And on the other hand, in the French the French wing, you got Bataille and Lacan, which is a nice combo as well, because Bataille, of course, identifies very strongly in key moments as a Nietzschean, and is also a reader of Freud. He's also an analysand in Freud's school, the Parisian Psychoanalytic Society, the Freud-affiliated psychoanalytic school that was founded in Paris. He was analysed there by Adrien Borel in the society that Lacan eventually joined and was a part of until Bataille's death. I reckon it was about 1961 where he left. So we've got Bataille having this Nietzsche and Freud connection. So them three talking will be pretty interesting. Then you got Lacan, who is obviously like a card-carrying Freudian, more so than Bataille, but also read Nietzsche quite avidly when he was in his 20s, when breaking his way from his mother's Catholicism, as one scholar put it. And then you got him and Bataille actually knowing each other. They were acquaintances and friends all their life. Bataille's first wife, Sylvia Bataille, the movie star, eventually became Lacan's second wife, with the daughter Laurence Bataille sort of passing between them too. So no bad blood. Everybody likes to fantasize that this was the cuckold of the century, but they stay friends all their lives. So I'm not sure that's the case, but feel free to fantasize away. If Sylvia could pop in and add her piece, that would be fantastic as well. But the discussion there would be fantastic. And there's also the idea by some scholars that, again, Bataille anticipates much in Lacan, or Lacan borrows key parts from Bataille, and it's only partly acknowledged. But there could also be some coincidences, given that there is some Nietzsche and Freud in both their background and also the sociology, the French sociology of people like Marcel Mauss. And then there's Lacan's presence as a silent witness in Assoufal and the College of Sociology, as some scholars have reported. So there's a lot to talk about, and there'll be a lot, I think, for us to finally, find out about from the horse's mouths.
Adam, do you have any immediate thoughts on that room?
Yeah, that will be a very fantastic and interesting room, I think. So that's like, I think that will be, we'd find out very interesting stuff, I think.
I think it'd be fairly intense. I mean, Freud and Lacan, you've already got two extremely dominating figures there. I mean, and then Nietzsche and Bataille. I have read the biography of Circa's biography of Bataille, but his personality is fairly difficult to penetrate. I always found. I don't know, if he would be a peculiar figure, a shy figure, or, would he sort of, him and Nietzsche sit there in silence or something like this. But I think I'm always interested in a room if Freud and Lacan were in it, as to who would take the reins, because, I mean, would Lacan sort of, say, look, you are who I returned to, so I should really sit down and listen, or would he, retain his position as the master? It's a difficult question. But I mean, is there a key question there for you, Tim, to be worked out?
To be what? Sorry?
Is there a key question in that room that you think, something you'd like to find out between that conversation?
Yeah, just those questions of who borrowed from who and who anticipated what. Like those questions will be fascinating. Freud and Lacan, it would be like, I think Lacan would try to convince Freud of the importance of language and structuralist linguistics, and then later on the sort of mathematical stuff. And I'm not sure Freud would go along with it immediately. Freud being more of a sort of naturalist and an empiricist, I think, than Lacan. Nietzsche, well, the thing with Nietzsche would be like, one thing Freud thought is that what differentiated him from Nietzsche is that Nietzsche failed to recognize infantilism, or the importance of infantile sexuality. And maybe there's bits where Nietzsche does acknowledge infantile sexuality, but there's nowhere near the amount of detail on the libidinal mechanisms and structures that you get in Freud, because, one's a philosopher, one's a psychologist. So they had different projects, but yet they were also very similar. So, yeah, just get them drunk and see what happens. Get them talking about all of it.
It sounds good, but the room in a way does lead us to one of the peculiar questions, which I think, I hadn't really thought about this until preparing these questions. Bataille holds such a peculiar place. So when I was in art school, Bataille was on the fringes of quite a lot of discussions. He's often used by artists. He's used by everyone, sort of used up, and he'd probably quite like that. But he doesn't necessarily have a firm footing, so you wouldn't emphatically put him as a philosopher. But then, as your own work shows, that he has this key position within psychoanalysis, but then he also takes a place in the art world. And then you also have this Nietzschean thing of, well, it's something a bit more than philosophy, into the realms of poetic philosophy, and then, of course, Blue of Noon and books of these kinds, transgressive fiction as well. And so the question really is, where, perhaps we can begin with you, Adam, what role do you think Bataille predominantly takes right now? Or do you think he's ever taken a clear, emphatic role? Or we still don't, do we know what to do with him?
Yeah, I'd first like to just talk a little bit about how I found Bataille, or how I discovered Bataille, because I think it's very I think it's instructive. I read a little book by an author called Guido Preparata, which is called The Ideology of Tyranny, and it's a book which explains how Michel Foucault, is the sort of hidden force behind neoliberalism. It's a very polemical and very anti-postmodern book. And the author you can see that the author really hates postmodernism. And Preparata explains that behind Foucault is Bataille. And so Bataille is the sort of hidden motor of contemporary society, Prabhata thinks. And this got me thinking that how is it that this is the sort of hidden force behind postmodernism, Bataille? And I thought that this is worth something. This is worth exploring. I think this sort of hidden connection, because it wasn't evident for me. I was a little bit familiar with Foucault's work, but I'd never read anything from Bataille before. This was about like 10 years ago. And then I discovered I was also searching for nihilism, contemporary nihilism. Since Nietzsche, so post-Nietzschean nihilism. And I found this book by Nick Land called The Thirst for Annihilation. I'd never read anything like that before. And that was these were my two gateways to Bataille. I read these sort of at the same time. And I realized that Bataille is someone who is, or was someone who is somehow hugely influential. As all these postmodern thinkers who have obviously had a huge effect on the social sciences, cultural studies, philosophy, and all of them, some from Julia Kristeva to Derrida, Deleuze, and obviously Foucault, all of them refer to Bataille often. And in fact, if we look at their works closely, we can see that actually. And Lacan, obviously, and we can see how all of their works are somehow influenced by Bataillean concepts sort of emerge in their work. And I think that Bataille is a sort of like, I guess, not the only key, but one of the keys to understanding what postmodernism wants to be about. Because it's very often, like, especially like in Derrida's work, it's very hard to pinpoint what these authors are trying to do. But Bataille gives like a sort of answer to this question, I think. And I'm not trying to say that postmodernism is about one thing only. But I think Bataille helps sort of explain what postmodernism is, I guess. And that's one of the reasons why, for me, Bataille is so important, and it's so crucial to, I think, take Bataille seriously, even if I'm also saying that academic philosophy shouldn't be taken too seriously. So I think these two things are connected. So this is the reason why I chose Bataille to explore more deeply.
It's interesting you mentioned the Nick Land book because, you mentioned you read nothing like it, and I don't think we'll ever really see much like it again. But I was thinking about it last night, actually. That was my entry into Bataille's work proper, because you see his whole oeuvre sort of translated throughout. And I'm not sure now. It's a great introduction to the atmosphere of what it is to perhaps, if you said, right, I want to be possessed by Bataillean philosophy, here we go, let's see what happens. But Land states at the beginning that he's not, I think he says something like, Bataille's sexual obsessions, I know nothing about them. And I realized, wow, what is a Bataille book without the eroticism and the psychoanalytical sexual stuff? So in that way, you begin with that book, you begin with a very lopsided, mechanical Bataille. And I don't think we can leave out this, why Freud, Lacan, and Nietzsche as these three figures are probably going to haunt this discussion. I mean, we can't leave out the biography, which is almost like became his philosophy. If you read his biographical material, it's emphatic that his life was a philosophy in a way. Tim, I mean, as we go, so I guess to draw those things in together, we mentioned this idea of postmodernism and Bataille being this sort of foundation. In what sense can we begin to draw these things together, draw in this psychoanalytical sort of moment as a foundation, and how it sort of splinters off into becoming postmodernism? Because I saw you agreeing there with what Adam was saying.
Yeah, it's a tricky question. I mean, there is, I guess, the counter perspective would be the Bataille scholar and translator Michael Richardson, who thinks that this is a sort of a kind of a faux move to sort of see Bataille as as a postmodernist. And looking at Richardson's work, his argument is that Foucault separates the notion of transgression from taboo, and thus what's concrete in Bataille's work. And I had to think about that, and I think what Richardson means is that what taboos are a taboo on is nature, our animal nature, our animal drives and instincts pertaining to sex and death, right? And this is sort of like very different to the sort of postmodern kind of some of the currents within postmodernism, which would instead say nature is a construction, everything's a text, everything's signifier, right? And that sometimes like is a trend within Lacanian studies as well. That's not the only trend again, but there is one of the ways that Lacan is kind of read. Lacan's own Freudian analyst actually thought Lacan was too obsessed with signifiers and language, and as if he was trying to reduce everything to words. And you can say that's Lacan's emphasis, but sometimes you think, geez, that's a lot of emphasis, and I can see how he's read this way. But so Richardson's going to say, no, Bataille's not doing that. And he also has this idea that postmodernism, in thinking that nature is a construction, that everything is a text, also wants to argue that there's no durations, everything's fluid, and this is just as dogmatically asserted as the sort of Platonic idea that there were pure, perfect forms or essences. So there's either pure, perfect forms and essences which are immortal, or there's absolutely none, and everything's totally fluid, signifiers slipping all over the place. And sort of Richardson's arguing that that's just a turn, jump out of one frying pan into another frying pan, miss the whole fire altogether maybe, or into the fire, however you want to look at it. So that would be one way where I think through that sort of counter argument, it's interesting then to see how Bataille may or may not fit into the sort of notion of postmodernism. Then there's the question of surrealism too. Like for Richardson, part of the postmodern tendency was to separate too much Bataille from his surrealist colleagues because of the role of psychoanalysis in there and primitivism in there, body anthropology. Again, so that's a sort of another sort of way to look at that issue there.
I want to abuse the metaphor you used there and try to draw it out a bit, because I think it's actually a pretty good where we might find Bataille's place. You talked about, are we on the one hand pure Platonic forms, the hegemony of pure Platonic forms or universals, and then jump from that frying pan, miss the fire altogether into the slippery world of there's nothing outside the text or all over the place. I would say is Bataille in the fire? Is he saying, look, you guys, you're missing some experience which he's always struggling to articulate, but he, in a very Bataille move, would say, you know what, I'm going to stand in the fire. And what if you agree with me, what is that for fire? Why you mentioned the surrealist thing, and I think the reason we're struggling to place Bataille is, if you read about his chronology, he's constantly sort of saying he's very nomadic. He's a nomadic figure. He stays in one place for a little bit and sort of he never finds his footing in a certain place. And so what is it, where does he retreat to, which is, unable to be rooted?
I would say the notion of the real, which is something that Lacan apparently borrowed from Bataille, and the real is something that Bataille particularly articulates in terms of the heterogeneous. It's that which we usually fail to articulate. It's that which we say this is what nature is. The bit we leave out because it's too disturbing, that's the heterogeneous. That's the real. Heterology is going to study that part. My work is going to study that part. I'm going to get called an excremental philosopher by my friend, sometimes enemy Breton, but they're occluding this. They're flying too high towards the sun, these Icaruses, and I'm here to point out the shit stain on their trousers. That's sort of where I would place Bataille. So it's the fire, and maybe there's some shit in there too, or some grease, or some lots of nasty bits. Not that he wants to just dwell in there all the time. He just wants to say this is part of the cycle: putrefaction, death, decay. It's part of our cycle of experience.
Adam, do you want to comment on this
Yes, I guess in relation to the language centrism of postmoderns, this is like I think it's one of the most frequent arguments against the postmoderns is that they are somehow too language or discourse centric. Like researchers often write that about Foucault, that Foucault is too much focused on texts and language and discourse, and like Derrida as well. And I think it's important to sort of separate these things in the sense that I think it's not always valid for all of the postmoderns. Like we have to differentiate between like these more materialist-oriented postmodern figures like Deleuze and Guattari, for example, and they were also hugely influenced by Bataille. And so I think it's very important to sort of, and also to sort of examine each case very closely. Like Foucault always denied, like in interviews, for example, he denied that he's reducing reality to language. It's more complex than that. Like basically the gist of what, at least as I understand what Foucault was doing, for example, is sort of examining how reality is always more than the constructs we apply, like the sort of the classifications used by power to classify like life or reality, though it always escapes classification. I think that's a point which sometimes eludes the critics of postmodernism. Not that I want to identify myself as a postmodern, but I think it's the sort of language-centric critiques of postmodernism sort of sometimes make the postmoderns into a caricature, I guess. Like when they just extract this one sentence from Derrida that all the text is everything or something like that. So.
This, I guess, in a way, this. Tim, you've sort of mentioned something interesting. I was trying to find a way here to then, we have this peculiar foundation here of where Bataille is placed, and this slippery existence which he holds within philosophy as being perhaps a route for some people, but he has a relationship with experience, and as we've said, this sort of middle ground. And you mentioned something which I think I don't want to avoid almost, because otherwise we do a disservice to Bataille. And I almost want to say, what is it about excrement which would allow us to open up what Bataille is actually all about? Because now I think about it, you have basically Bataille's, just to throw in an anecdote to maybe open this up, and we can move into the nihilist and atheological aspects as well, but using excrement as our base to do so. Biographically, Bataille wanted to become a Dominican. And I find that really interesting that actually he was extremely sincere and really was almost like mystically constipated. He's like trying to really force this inner experience. And it's really funny to me that Thomas Merton also wrote a book called The Inner Experience, and both of them come to a conclusion from that idea. And But like nothing came out, right? Nothing appeared. And so from that absolute absence of anything happening, he then forces something from the nihilism of the moment. And it's almost like, well, if God, if you're not going to give me anything, then I will go in the absolute opposite direction and put just as much sort of energy and vitality into doing that. But what you find in that opposite direction is an acceptance of, the solar anus, the whatever you want to call it, the absolute base materialism of reality. And so why is this wastage, this excremental philosopher, as you've mentioned, why, if you agree, would this maybe be like sort of a kernel to use to open up what Bataille is even doing?
The constipation metaphor is a good one, and of course, I wouldn't be doing psychoanalysis any service if I didn't go on with that one a little bit. But because Bataille actually uses the term block when he talks about why his inner experience is not really a mysticism, or it's not mysticism as traditionally conceived, is because traditional mystics even if they might say we don't know what God is, just by having God there is for Bataille a block. This is what he talks about in an experience. It's a block on the flow. Once it's there, it already assumes too much. It already says too much, and it's not going to happen. It's not going to go. It's going to be stuck. It's not going to come out. I'm not going to get that in an experience. And so I guess what one gets when one removes that block is a kind of liberation from the idea of that we should somehow try and find the anal ring in the starry sky, as Lacan puts it in his Ethics, where, Bataille is like totally located in the body, and he sort of plays in his early work with sort of having everything sexualized or analyzed. But these resemblances aren't completely sort of out of the blue, because, these are natural processes, just as our natural processes. We come from the same, Big Bang, if you like. So it's not a surprise that our sexual act is in some ways a parody of other processes, with the earth turning and cheese rising. And, of course, mammals, our nearest mammal cousins resemble our sexual act most directly. But, and it's also what psychoanalysis has sort of found too. It's that our sexuality is not just our genitals. It's the anus, the oral and the anal, are very significant sort of component instincts or partial drives to the libido. And when they're not really factored in, they get projected all over the place. So, Bataille is sort of, I think, playing with those sorts of flows as well.
Adam, any comment?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to. So one of the chapters in the book will be, or is, I guess, but so one of the chapters is about eroticism and how I guess how we have to also take serious. I guess it's easy to dismiss the sort of erotic works of Bataille as a sort of literature or somehow like almost infantile kind of stuff. He's maybe just parodying the Sade or something. So like someone could easily say that this is just fantasizing or whatever. But I think it's important to sort of take seriously the eroticism aspect and how it's central, I think, to Bataille's system of philosophy. Like he has this unfinished book, I think, called a System of Non-Knowledge, something like that. So it's important to see, I think, that Bataille, despite the sort of fragmented appearance of his work, it's actually, I think, very systematic. There's actually a program there, if we look closely. So that's basically what we experimented with, is sort of how to create a systematic philosophy from these sort of fragmented kind of stuff. And the eroticism is actually, that's the first chapter we begin with. And it's very important to take it seriously, because it's often, it's not really emphasized enough, I think. In philosophy, the sexual is still something which is scatological almost, or I don't know.
How did you go about building a system? I'm interested in what the systems have beginnings, means, and ends. I'm sort of interested in these. I mean, what's the end for Bataille?
Well, I guess the concept of like energy and flow, or jouissance, the sort of enjoyment. I think that's fundamental, the libidinal aspect, because that feeds into his ideas about the economy and society. So Bataille was also, I think, a sociologist in his own right. I think he even he called himself a sociologist. They did the College of Sociology, I think that was what it was called. And so it's important to see how his later work on the accursed share and the sort of sacrificial economy, that's not separable from his work on eroticism, because I guess erotic enjoyment is a sort of a sacrifice, I guess, a sort of expenditure of energy which results in enjoyment. So it's a very economic way of thinking, but it's not in the conventional sense of economy as a closed system. So it's more of an open system. Yeah, I guess what later became called open systems thinking, this idea that we don't have to think in terms of a limited closed economy with finite resources, but rather in terms of an open, there's always too much of everything, I guess. That's like, I think, a good summary of what Bataille is talking about. And this applies to erotic life and economic and social life. So these things, I think, for what Bataille is searching for is a sort of way of thinking about these phenomena on a general level. So he's looking for a theory which applies to all of these levels. So I think it's way more ambitious than what he is given credit for usually.
This seems a good place to actually draw in, and the figure who's perhaps been a bit overlooked in that room, Nietzsche. This seems to be connections here to that difference between passive and active nihilism. How you're going to take up an acceptance of how, man's place in the world. How are you going to take this up and interact with it and deal with it? And this draws me back to probably the section in Land's book on Bataille, which I found the most revealing, where he expands upon what's meant by the solar anus, right? The sun as this, basically this ball of waste energy in the sky, where for Bataille, the entire meaning of anything comes down to, are the sun's rays bilateral or unilateral, right? If they were unilateral, focused solely on the earth, we could say, look, there's a point. But no, they are just completely firing out at random. And the fact that the rays of the sun, this expansive energy which allows anything to be at all it really is the waste product of a star that just happens to hit the earth. But then you'd bring in Nietzsche and say, okay, well, what do we do with that? And Tim, where do we move on from that with that? Where does Bataille move on from that position of Nietzsche's?
Well, I think that one of the key things in Nietzsche that Bataille really liked was this notion of subjective sovereignty, a sovereignty of the subject outside of utilitarian purpose, outside of things, a sovereignty of the subject expressing its animal drives, the aggressive and the sexual. And the sexual is very important in Nietzsche, which comes from his notion of Dionysus. He declares himself at the end a disciple of Dionysus. And for Nietzsche, it's no accident that the importance of Dionysus or sexuality and affirming sexuality was lost, because in his own genealogy, it was the nihilism of Platonism, of Plato and Socrates, combined with the nihilism of the later Judaic tradition, which entered into Christianity, which became Christianity when they spliced together. It was that which gave Eros poison to drink, which turned it into a vice. So we have today this sort of notion that our sexuality is a problem. It's something to condemn. It's something to control. It's something to police and moralize. It's all going to lead to violence, to vice. And Nietzsche's sort of response to that, it's a proto sort of Freudian response to that, is saying, because we lost the ability to properly incorporate and affirm our natural drives and instincts, our libidinal drives. So if you do a cross-cut, say, from the ancient Greek sort of divinities, they're animal, they're sexual, they fight, they fuck, they're sexual objects, they take us as sexual objects, then cut across the sort of like Puritan caricature of Jesus and Mary, like they're both pure and innocent, and like, or the poor kid at the end who's like nailed to the cross, castrated, mutilated his animal body. And, like for Nietzsche, this is very much a case of, he infamously refers to Jesus as a case of retarded puberty, saying like to sort of retreat from nature and the drives and sexuality like that. There's something got stuck for the poor kid somewhere. And like, it's not as if like he had the answer with his purely desexualized sort of vision, and we just haven't applied it properly because the church is full of bad men, bad women too, but usually gets neglected. And it's like, no, there's something in this sort of retarded puberty in the first place, which means Eros is going to come back as a vice. The Christians are going to go around and kill anyone who doesn't believe what they believe, which is what they pretty much did for 1,000 years. And that's the Dark Ages, right? The sacking of the temples, relabeling classical religion as pagan, which means rural or peasant or barbarian. The loss of like literature that occurred there, the intimidation of the intellect for scientists and intellectuals who questioned any of the dogma. And most importantly, is what Bataille really takes up too. It's like, it's the dualist notion in the Christian Platonic structure that's the problem. The idea that there's mind and body, and one of them is good and the other one's bad. Mind is good because it's connected to pure spirit, and that's the real. Body is bad because it falls away from the pure spirit, where the good is or where God is or where heaven. And so that's bad. So we have this sort of binary of good versus evil coming in, and we become what Nietzsche calls a soul voluntarily at odds with itself. We become possessed by this ascetic ideal, an ideal of self-denial. We become despisers of the body. And, with attempts to sort of liberate sexuality, it doesn't seem like we've really found a nice sort of way to sort of incorporate libidinal jouissance or expression as a whole. And again, it gets absorbed into things like capitalist exploitation, for example, or the sort of moralistic sort of exploitation of it. Look, that person's got a sexuality. Stone them, all these sort of Puritan hysteria, which are often waged under the guise of such things as feminism, which is like, this is just medieval like Christianity 101, and no one's calling it out because, that would be like, to be part of the Satan gang, and we don't want to do that. And, Eros is bad unless it's really narrowly constrained. And so I think, coming from Nietzsche, Bataille's focus on libido, sort of from Nietzsche and Freud's focus on libido, Bataille takes this up very well, adds the sociology of mouse to it. And his eroticism, I agree with that. I mean, it's so important. And it was actually my introduction to Bataille, discovering Story of the Eye when I was quite young and viscerally aroused and amazed by it. And then later on discovering the 1957 almost epitome of his sort of philosophical work, the 1957 text Eroticism, which is a sort of later version of the unpublished volume 2 of The Accursed Chair. I think I don't think actually anybody has understood eroticism more profoundly than Georges Bataille, and it shows up in not just in his philosophical works on the erotic, but in his literature, like Story of the Eye, masterpiece. Sylvia said that it's a masterpiece. There was no scandal for us. It was just a masterpiece, and all of us agreed.
It's something interesting, just to draw on that a little bit more. There's with the Platonic, with the Christian, and this sort of notion of moralism and the mind-body split, as you say, and the body increasingly throughout history, the Christians, in a certain sense, drawing on the Platonic tradition and having this somewhat arm's length relationship. It's a bit dampened from the Neoplatonists who absolutely loathe the body, but Christians still have those ascetic virtues. I'm thinking of Plato's Phaedrus, the Phaedrian chariot. So the two horses which are drawn. Is your soul going to be drawn towards the passions, the body, or is it going to be drawn towards something higher? And what interests me in that is actually realizing now is that Bataille is probably saying, well, actually that left-hand horse, which is going towards the passions, always has a relationship with. We've never really seen where that can go and as far as it can go. So maybe Bataille would, unchain all the other horses and just start whipping that one until that's my question is, where does that lead us? What philosophically does that open up when we say, you know what, actually forget this. Once you've looked at it through that Nietzschean lens, you'll understand what it is and you'll understand what it's doing is this sort of oppression. Let's just saddle up this horse and whip it. And I say whip it because there is this relationship with sort of the overlapping of pain and pleasure for Bataille. Where would that lead us? Where do we end up? What happens? Is there some emancipation? Is there something brought forth philosophically?
I'll just add quickly there that Bataille does seem to advocate unlimited excess, unlimited transgression, and he knows he's being looked at that way. But I think it's to him a matter of like getting that balance right. that because the taboos are too stuck, too prohibitive, and even though we're in a world full of like vices, these are not because there's too much transgression. These are because there's too much sticky, prohibitive taboos, which are causing these sort of displaced returns. So, sure, let the passions roam free, but within an arena is I think where the mature Bataille gets to. Transgression and taboo are always related. If you look at something like a modern example might be something like sport. So, for example, MMA or UFC. There's things you can't normally do on the street that you can do in that arena, right? You can elbow, you can knee, you can kick, you punch someone in the face. You can't pull out a knife. You can't go on with it as soon as, the referee goes like, and there's all the micro sort of attention to like, oh, did he do this? Did he gouge the eye? And Bataille makes that point too. Like, it's when the taboo's being transgressed that you get this really fine-tuned attentiveness to the taboo. Like, is it being transgressed in the right amount at the right time? Too much this way, not enough that way. And this becomes very important, on balance for the kind of elderly Bataille of the accursed share and, the eroticism text.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think, that I think society today, like liberal democracies today, I think, are sort of incapable of changing themselves without some sort of moral panic being involved. Like, moral panic seems to be the dominant self-programming mode of society today. Maybe this is a bit of a controversial idea, but I think there's some truth in this. And I think Bataille and Nietzsche, so the Nietzschean Bataille, I guess, is very important in critiquing these sorts of discourses. These discourses that we are morally correct and there's some sort of external enemy, the friend-enemy distinction, I guess, in like the Schmittian sense, that the enemy is always the evil one, the outside, the Satan, Lucifer, and we are on the good side. And this is like in imperialism, for example, this is very common in imperialist discourses, the axis of evil and stuff like that. So Bataille, I think, is very important in going beyond good and evil in this sense, and always in critiquing and being reflexive on how good is always constructed through constructions of evil, I guess, and sort of scapegoating mechanisms. And I think, for example, René Girard, for example, is a very interesting author who was, I think, also influenced by Bataille. He does cite Bataille on several occasions. And this is what Girard talks about a lot, how the scapegoat is always constructed through these mimetic mechanisms in society. So Bataille is also useful in a social, like a sociological sense, in sort of helping us expose and critique these mechanisms. I think this is just something which occurred to me.
So Bataille has a critique generally of that notion of sort of, perhaps something bubbles up to the surface, some animalistic, erotic, excremental, strange, supposed strange oddity of human life, appears from nowhere, and our first thing to do is reason it, judge it, hand it over to the empire and say, look, can you do something with this? And as you say, you need this sort of big theater of moral panic to be able to go, see, look, it's fine now, we've justified it. But I wonder if at the point where the mimesis of the crowd and at the point where something is commonly accepted, I wonder if Bataille would say, well, you haven't really dealt with that yourself, so you don't know, you haven't actually, in the Freudian sense, taken that in and actually used that. In its own sense, you're just allowing the reason and judgment of others to go, okay, that's okay. Like you've said, that's okay. There's still this sort of checking with everyone else. But I mean, this is a question really of experience, because Bataille is ultimately an experiential philosopher. So how does he deal with this problem that he's constantly running into of, well, what I'm talking about are emphatically experiential things, and this is probably the point where we well, I guess we'd have to say, look, this is where he veers away from being a philosopher into this a theologian, this strange figure who's doing something. I don't know exactly how to describe it because it's difficult with language, and I think this is also what he struggled with.
Yeah, I think his work on literature and evil, I think is an interesting one to look at, the idea of inner experience. It's one of his 1957 collections made up of articles that he wrote while he was editing the journal Critique after the war. And he sort of like affirms figures like sort of the Marquis de Sade. He's not endorsing everything Sade did and said through his characters, but there was something he commends in Sade, which was that he commends in a lot of them, even William Blake, who he's critical of, but also commends him. It's like they dare to stare the real in the face. They do not turn away from these desires, these drives that haunt them. They dare to look the real in the face, and they give expression to them in their literature. And that's something that we can learn from. We can learn from that by reading them. So we have more awareness of these sort of aggressive and perverse impulses. And we also have something we can do with them, which is express them and enjoy them through artistic practice, which is what we used to basically do in religion. It used to be the aesthetic aspects of early religion were about the ritual, the sacrifice, the orgy. It was about a return to a version of animality, to those primitive drives, so they can be expressed. That was sacred time. And that was shifted. The profane and the sacred was shifted once we got to Platonism and then Christianity. Sacred time was about reinforcing the taboos by confessing any transgression so we can be more pure. So it's completely flipped around. And that's why the imagery is sort of so different, except for the Renaissance, which tries to bring back some of antiquity, feeling that he had strayed too much, too far from Greece and Rome. And, Bataille's investment of surrealism was to say via Freud's technique of free association and via the sociology that we can go back even further to primitivism, not just back to like, Plato and Aristotle, which is where the Renaissance tended to get a bit stuck. Let's go a little bit further. Classical, archaic Greece, and also all the primitive cultures all around the world, and look at how they structure taboo and transgression, and how the time for transgression is a sacred moment of religion, but it's an aesthetic aspect of religion. It's an aestheticized kind of process: song, dance, festival, sex, sacrifice, games. Like Calwa has his book about games, which is also very, very interesting.
I wonder then, it's often said, or often thought or assumed, I would say, in the, we mentioned neoliberalism actually at the beginning in relation to Foucault and a couple of other people, this sort of postmodern, so-called neoliberal Western era that we're in, and this notion of, a lot of freedoms seem to have appeared, a lot of so-called taboos are supposedly being overcome. There seems to be a lot of emancipation, especially sexually. But I wonder if there would still be this emphasis of Bataille that you still almost this the neurotic fixation on the overcoming of a taboo is itself like a loop of getting caught up in that sort of empire that we've been talking about. Haven't really allowed yourself to open to them because you're still in the discussion of something else which we've been trying to avoid. You're still in sort of getting very Freudian here, but you're still sort of caught up, very Lacanian here, you're still caught up in the desires of and the language of something which is really not you. You've begun from the foundation of, I'm not sure what Bataille would call it, something very utilitarian.
I would just like to I think a great example of what you're mentioning is this, in modernity, there's this idea that we have become disenchanted and distanced from like transcendence and religion and stuff. And some of these, I think Bataille is also in a biographical sense. Bataille is an example in many ways of this modern subject who is searching for new ways of transcendence within immanence, I guess, if it's not a too abstract way of putting it. And this kind of this ordeal of there's this ordeal of the modern subject who is struggling to find new pathways. I think a great example is Aleister Crowley, for example, who tried to sort of find ways back to the sacred through transgressions, through violating all of these sexual taboos. And but it's at the end of the day, it's highly doubtful that where he ended up. I guess I don't know if it's a successful or unsuccessful career. It's obviously different because Aleister Crowley was an occultist, and it's a different genre. But I think Bataille also Bataille influenced, for example, Mishima Yukio, the famous Japanese novelist, and who met a very tragic fate because he ended up committing ritual suicide. So this is interesting that Bataille is sort of Bataille was, I think, conscious of the dangers of this search for transcendence. So Bataille, I don't think Bataille had illusions about finding anything like the sacred at the end of the tunnel or something. There is this sort of mysticism, but it's, again, as Tim mentioned, it's a mysticism without an end goal. There's no positive notion of God at the end of the day. So Bataille isn't trying to go back somehow to a sort of sacred, or not a reversed sacred either. So it's not an example of these Satanism or something, because that's also it's just a reversed image of the Christian God. So it's very more complex than that. But there are ways of reading Bataille as a sort of a reverse mystic or something. But I think he's very much more than that. Bataille is very conscious of this, really going beyond the good and evil paradigm, or this dualism that really is still part of Western culture, I think, even today. And these examples of transgressive mysticism are really instructive in how. So Crowley is, again, the reason I mentioned Crowley is that I think Crowley is an example of how someone can get stuck in this loop, I guess.
So in that sense, we shouldn't maybe consider Bataille. He's often thrown into the nihilist camp. We shouldn't consider him a nihilist.
It depends on what someone calls a nihilist, I think. But I think a nihilist, he wasn't a dogmatic nihilist who affirms nothingness as a sort of absolute value. I think it's a more sort of a nihilist who always negating even his own positions. So he didn't intend his teachings to be some sort of new orthodoxy or something.
In Nietzschean terms, he's somebody who overcomes nihilism by saying that nature, animality, that has value. Believing in something beyond and external to it, defined over and against it, that's the nihilism, because that thing isn't real. So in the way Nietzsche defined or theorized nihilism, Bataille is very much not a nihilist. Say, for example, in the Blue of Noon section of Inner Experience, he talks about this sort of paradoxical movement of falling up, which, of course, when you fall, you usually fall down. But when you fall up into the void of the sky, you get a sense of vertigo and free fall at this earth that is just scraps at your feet, because what has value has been defined as something opposite to the earth. This is classic in Plato's the Phaedo. There's just this sort of, and Nietzsche's really sort of keen to sort of point this out. And you sort of see this in the versions of certain versions of Christian heaven too. It's like the main salient feature of this pure spirit, this world of the good, is that it's not like the world of becoming, nature, which has bodies and drives and, perverse sexuality and aggression, trees and animals. And, it's not nature. It's the opposite. And, so the nihilism is then treating nature as something, to negate because it has no value in and of itself. And the overcoming of nihilism is to see nature as valued once more. And this is why actually Nietzsche broke away from Schopenhauer's pessimism, because he thought Schopenhauer's pessimism was to say, God is dead. Now we're just stuck with this shitty thing called earth and nature, and my horrible body and desire and the will and libido never gets you anywhere. It's just horror and sadness and, I'm going to go play the flute, right? This is where Nietzsche rejected Schopenhauer. So you need to make one more step, Schopenhauer. Get away from the idea that because God is dead, there's no value anywhere. There's no meaning anywhere. It's right here. It's right here in the body and the earth and nature. And look, after we put taboos on nature, on body, on animality, when it's time to transgress the taboos, we don't go back to these just sort of physical, like material, empty objects. Like when we've got a whole bunch of desire that's like ready to kind of reinvest nature in the body. And so what the animal body becomes is poetic and divine, though still animal, right? So that's why the Zeus and Hera myths are better to look at what he means by divine and poetic rather than the Jesus Mary myths. Poetic and divine, but still resolutely animal. As gods will sometimes change into animals. And he's a fantastic work, Bataille's fantastic work on the Paleolithic cave paintings used to say that the animals were the gods. It wasn't that the gods had animal sides that would sometimes morph into animals. They were the animals. What was like this sort of shameful object was the early human being who felt that they had to leave animality behind in order to survive and gain evolutionary advantage. So there's a massive shift where we feel ashamed for having animal drives and instincts. Well, back in the early Paleolithic times, there was a shame in having human tendencies to try and leave animality and start thinking about future and self-preservation and shelters and concepts and ideas and tools. But where I think from a Nietzschean perspective, we once got it right was, in a very striking way, was classical Greece. And Lacan sort of stresses this too in Seminar, right? The sort of this intellectual, creative and artistic climax that we had in classical Athens of the 5th century BC, not the 4th century where Plato started becoming the dominant trend, 5th century, where Thucydides was, dominant, Pericles, Democritus, these sorts of figures. That's where they kind of got the balance right. And this is sort of backed up a little bit in Freud too, to say, that if we treat our sexuality as something, something like we better not like touch, then it lays down the pattern for how we like act in other areas of life. We become well-behaved weaklings, easily manipulated, exploited, docile bodies. And Nietzsche says, like, classical Athens, the sexual symbols were venerated as such. Think about the sort of horror that people have towards, say, something like pornography today in polite circles. Pornography is everywhere, but separate. No one wants to affirm pornography in polite company or intellectual circles. It's always like, oh no, the poor people, wouldn't that be terrible? Having sex with other healthy athletic bodies for money instead of what I do at the office, or Amazon fulfillment center or Macca's or wherever it is that I work. There are terrible things about the sex industry too, of course, but that's because, to a certain extent, capitalism turns everything into shit. I don't think the Neoliberal Academy is doing any better. having lots of experience teaching there, it's a terrible ordeal wherever we go, and that's neoliberal capitalism. It's austerity and capitalism for the poor and the workers, socialism and tax havens, and for the super rich. And then, James, as you were saying, it's like, so what do we do with our sexuality? Let's ask our local oligarchs. Putin's it. Let's all like Putin, Russia. Yeah. Well, without bothering to check that the oligarchs of the West and the East are tending to do okay out of the sort of horrible misery being inflicted on the Ukrainian people, and the horrible misery that's going to be afflicted more and more on all people in the fact that our oligarchs are fighting over natural gas reserves instead of like using that money to fund, say, a green transition.
So where should we? What I guess for Bataille, it's very difficult to say what we should do or where we should look or something like this. How does one begin for Bataille to perhaps crack this shell, to begin to have this Bataillean relationship with their desires, a Bataillean understanding? What needs to be scratched away to begin this odd process? Because I think for it seems to me for Bataille, I mean the so-called end result, though I don't think there would ever be a defined end, because once you have excess and expenditure and waste and these things, it's always flowing and becoming, as we've mentioned. I think in a way, the strangeness of Bataille and perhaps he himself happened to have some fairly excessive desires and was very open about his desires. But this trajectory of like Bataillean sovereign subject could also lead one perhaps even to a life of asceticism. But it would be through a process of something which we don't have right now, some strange base honesty. And I guess that's the how do you begin that? What does that look like for Bataille to begin that process? We can't simply copy him.
Well, it's not easy to control one's drive. So I think every subject has their own battles with jouissance, various forms of addiction. Not necessarily exactly the same as Bataille's own, but it can be difficult. And this is where ethics, I guess, some kind of ethics of the real is important, to say at least try and have some knowing awareness of what one's drives are and how they what one's preferences are and how they came to be what they are through one's, psychosexual history. Also then the sort of Marxist side of Bataille, which is very important. He's sort of dissident or enlarged Marxism. It's like, look at how political economy is being controlled and constrained by the bourgeois. So I think his work in The Accursed Share is very interesting in the volume 3 on sovereignty, because it's very much to say that it sounds like ridiculous to some Bataillean ears, but consciousness of erotic truth anticipates the end of history. Part of that truth is to say, okay, let's say we do have an equal distribution of all goods and services in the world, which is what the theory of communism is supposed to aim for. He's like, fine by me. That's what I want. That is step 1. Step 2 is, now what do we do with the rest of our drives, right? The step 1 is to do with taboos. Let's fine tune those taboos so that we have a accumulation of resources that's fair, rational, and well distributed. Then once we have a surplus, what do we do with it? We sacrifice it, or we transgress the taboos that were holding it back in a way that is not sort of so unconsciously destructive or manipulative. So if you're sort of arguing that where can an asceticism be part of one's sovereignty, is to not get caught up in the sort of outlets for the drive that are sort of imposed on us. For example, you might be watching some sport, right? You're also going to watch, if you're in Australia at the moment, probably everywhere in the West, you're going to watch 5 million KFC ads. Don't go eat KFC. That is just absolute poison. Like terrible, terrible, terrible food. If you're going to transgress in an oral direction, don't let the shitty advertisers who are dominating your screen while you're trying to watch someone kick a football around or punch someone else in the head as part of combat sport. Yeah. Don't let them tell you what to do with your transgressions. You got some aggression to get rid of. Don't just sort of listen to what the culture industry tells you should be the scapegoat or the target of your aggression. So that would be, I think, where some sovereignty of a sovereignty of denying, a sovereignty of restraint, or being able to hold back, can be, I think, of value. I know my drives. I know I'm a perverse animal deep inside. I'm going to do what I want with it, or what I think is best on balance or as a whole.
I would, regarding the social aspect, I guess the social philosophy aspect of Bataille, like what would Bataille, what would a Bataillean solution to social problems be? I think the accursed share is, I think, the most instructive in this regard, because I think Bataille is very much against these sort of accumulating societies, where be it America or the Soviet Union or whatever, like these. I think modern societies are somehow incapable of sacrifice. I think this is paradoxical, because the world wars and stuff. Modern societies are still wasting a lot of lives and a lot of resources. But I think a Bataillean diagnosis of capital accumulation would be that basically society is sort of like constipated, I guess. Like the accumulation is the result of the chronic constipation, and there's more and more resources piling up in the form of capital. And I think a Bataillean idea, I think Alan Stokel comes very close to a sort of Bataillean political theory. Stokel thinks that a sort of non-growth society would be something which is interesting, a Bataillean idea. Sort of, he mentions the idea of like bicycling, like cycling as a sort of spending our energies in a healthy way, which sort of contributes to our bodily health, but also spends the energy in a sort of I guess not a totally destructive way, like not in war or something like that. Another idea which I found in David Foster Wallace's novel Infinite Jest is the idea of shooting our wastes into space, like sort of spending the surplus of society in this way. And Bataille mentions, I think, space exploration somewhere, or maybe I think it's the nuclear weapons race, but that's a destructive form. But I think another sort of absurd way of spending the surplus would be to really shoot our wastes into space. But that's a sort of an absurdist idea, because I think there's only one Earth. So, but these are like two separate Bataillean solutions, if that's the correct word. So I think a non-growth based society, or paradoxically a sort of like a space exploration oriented type society. But that's also, I think that's a growth demand. So I think both of these would be like massive expenditures of surplus. Yeah.
That notion, I mean, I just want to perhaps, bring it right around to the beginning, this philosopher of excrement, that notion of society being constipated. It brings me to a thought which I think about quite a lot, the idea of, with constipation generally comes indigestion and the notion of overeating. And I think perhaps for Bataille there is something to be said for we live in a time, especially in the West, under capitalism, of sort of intense creation and supposed intense imagination, but there's so much to consume. You literally people talk about consumption on its own terms. Like, I'm going to binge watch this TV show, and it's almost as if the indigestion is as soon as something might arise from somewhere that you don't particularly, I don't know what to do with that. You just cram another donut down your hole and just continue on with your day and just keep doing that. And what everyone really needs to be crass on Bataille's terms, it seems what most people need to do is actually stop eating and actually take a crap, like just clear themselves out in a way, because it's there's so much creation and supposed imagination, because there's so much creation, but there's nothing new, and people keep cramming, but nothing develops from it. That we seem to be ever tightening the the spectrum of thought that we actually act within, despite the fact there's so much to, there's the odd paradox of the time of the most open access to the most information ever in human history, paradoxed with all we're making is the same superhero film over and over and over again. Like, why is that? And is it because perhaps what we need to do is enter into an atheological silence where, as the theologians and mystics would enter into a silence which would open themselves to something else. So there's another type of silence, sort of not necessarily inverted once again, but something that's opens itself to the base desires. I don't know. That's my my thought. I don't know if anyone has another thought to perhaps wrap up on that. I don't know. Or if you feel, maybe you don't feel indigested. Maybe you don't have indigestion.
Yeah, I think the Facebook algorithm is a good example of the lack of silence, where it's just like a superego, and it just says, like, you've got this comment to look at, you've got this new post to look at. And I go, do I? Like, am I working for you? Like, since when did I get this job? I don't remember signing a contract. And it just starts acting as if it knows what you want to see. Bam, you're going to look at this. Now you're going to look at that. And if you look at Facebook, is so sensitive when it comes to sexuality. It's like a Lutheran church group, or don't want to throw the Lutherans under a bus. It could be anything from the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition or Platonic tradition. There's a real lack of actual erotic knowledge or expression, and it's very difficult to actually exist in and express sort of anything to do with the erotic real. Like, I run a group on Facebook called the Bataille College of Pornography. Pornography is meant in the widened sense, like Freud had a widened sense of sexuality, right? But it also means pornography too. But of course, I don't show anything that's anywhere near a pornographic act, because even rated R is like prohibited. A nipple is prohibited. So many times you get censored by posting a great work of art because there happen to be a nipple somewhere or a naked buttock somewhere, and you're like, is that too much for for Facebook at the moment? So that's one of the places where it's good to just take a break and don't let them define where the taboos begin and end, because they have a different sort of system. And I'm not sure why they don't just allow us to actually say that our content is not meant for underage people like YouTube does. Therefore, they wouldn't have the sort of grounds to say, okay, we're going to censor everyone from sexual expression because there might be a kid who comes in and sees it. Mm. But don't let the kid come in. Like, isn't that what YouTube does? If you upload something to YouTube, don't you specify this is not child content, this is adult content? Maybe YouTube has its own way of censoring as well, but that seems like one little practical way of not being so Puritan when it comes to expressions of sexuality and eroticism.
It's a great example of what I was mentioning earlier, just about, the idea of we're the most open, expansive, emancipated society, but then an image of a buttock, oh dear, and that's one of the biggest sites in the world, right? So you still have this almost Victorian, cliche Victorian sensibility of, like a gasp at a breast or a buttock or something.
Oh yeah, sorry. I guess just regarding Facebook, that I think it's no accident that Facebook is, I guess, an American company. I guess there's something from American culture which is somehow maybe involved. Like the word, for example, the Quakers called each other friends. Like, I think that's just something which just came up. So it's like a global society of friends. I think that's actually the name for the Quaker church, for example. So I guess Facebook is a sort of a secularized, we could think of Facebook as a sort of secularized Protestant sect almost. So, but that's just a very speculative way of thinking about this stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess near the end here, we should probably mention, so the monograph is currently being translated, or has already been translated? It's being translated, and the goal is publishing it in, I think, around about next year.
That would be, I think, realistic. So it'll go through like a peer review process and everything. So we'll have Bataille scholars have a look at it, do some edits, things like that too.
Do you have a title in English? So for in a year.
Well, the Hungarian title translates to something like headless visions, but we'll see if we can come up with maybe a more accurate title. But because that's still the vision metaphor is something which is very much central to Western thinking. So maybe vision isn't the best thing, but that was the original title. Yeah, headless visions, because of the Atzerfall and stuff.
Mm-hmm. We didn't really touch on the Atzerfall. I mean, is there anything either of you would like to sort of add in that we've glossed over?
Well, with Atzerfall, we do have that sort of headless vision of returning to the body and its drives have been condemned to the head for too long. The moral, rational ego return to the body and its drives, express it as something of value, as something that is sacred, poetic and divine, though animal. And also thinking of the when Adam was talking about the title, I was thinking about that remarkable scene at the end of the Story of the Eye when he looks at Simone's open sex and sees the eye of Marcel, the one blue eye of WIN of Marcel, which is also the eye of the priest, gazing at him through tears of urine, and that he finds himself as the protagonist looking at this like a guillotine, like a neck waits for a guillotine to slice it. It's almost like once he sees that final vision, the head comes off, the eye of bad conscience that Nietzsche articulated so well in the essay 2 of the genealogy of morals, and Freud so well with his notion of the superego. This super eye is finally, locked off, finally to see the open sex of the transgressive Simone. And it's also, I think, from a psychoanalytic perspective, something that's very much related to the very important phallic phase in the child's psychosexual development, where the child, as the later Freud put it, thinks there's only one genital, the phallus. He thinks the clitoris is a phallus, just like the penis is a phallus. And it seems like someone got a bigger one than me. That's not fair. Seems like someone lost theirs. Oh no, am I going to lose mine? And there's how much that is fundamental, this castration complex or this rejection complex that does really operate in a lot of attempts to open sexual practice up to something more liberated. And so we come across that sort of that guillotine waiting to slice once more, because there's a lot we still are yet to fully incorporate as a society. Like psychoanalysis is completely marginalized insofar as it survives. There are all sorts of contrary tendencies going on within it. I'm sort of happy to be one of the few who are not going to talk about psychoanalysis outside of people like Bataille and one of his heroes, Nietzsche.
I think the Atzerfall is, we have a chapter on the politics or anti-politics of Bataille, and I think Atzerfall is like a wonderful metaphor for a sort of non-hierarchical social construct, and we connect it with the idea of sovereignty and the sort of exploding, taking sovereignty until it explodes, and a sort of like a headless idea of politics. I think it's a very powerful metaphor, the absence of a head. Like that's symbolically, that's immensely powerful, I think. And it's something which I think is it's a really ingenious invention, I guess. This idea of like a headless God, and this like we have this idea of the body politic, in Western political thinking, like since Hobbes and even before. And I think Atzerfall is like a sort of an anti-body politic, I guess. Not in the sense of being against the body, but as like an idea of a sort of almost like an expenditure which explodes power, I guess.
Well, you've de-seated reason, right? I mean, you've quite literally severed the head, the reason, and now you're what are you at the whim of? Not whim. What are you at? What's happening then? Once this sort of strange empire-based reason has been guillotined off, and yet this body's still wandering around. I mean, what's going on? What happens once reason and the lie of rationality has fallen away? Now let's see where we end up, wandering to.
We end up normally at Monday. We then it's time to expose the lie of transgression, and that's the sort of conflictual relation between taboo and transgression. Like, we lop the head off for the moment of the festival. We stick it back on, but not a sort of inflated one, right? We stick it back on for the work a week again, right? Where people like us pursue our lives as scholars, as academics, including Bataille. He wasn't at the brothel every single day of his whole life. He was editing a highly credible journal like Critique after the war. Fantastic pieces of writing, and his own corpus, fantastic pieces of writing and theorizing and philosophizing. So there's a time to lop the head off and there's a time to put it back on, and we get that sort of relation into a little bit more harmony. It's never going to be perfect, right? We're still always going to be this incomplete transition between animal to human that needs to go back to animal in some way, which becomes this third thing, the imaginary, which was usually the stuff of mysticism and religion. But by being aware of these three things, the symbolic realm of taboos, the real that is prohibited, the animality, and then when it returns through transgression in the imaginary, through times for play, like the weekend, Saturday night, for example, we get those sort of three realms through taboo and transgression working in a bit more harmony. So we're not just like a lopped off a body with no head walking around forever, which would be pretty like Bataille says, we might as well go back to bathing in filth and excrement if we think we can live without, taboos at all and just go back to nature, which is also his like little answer to Rousseau's idyll about nature, as if it's a pastoral symphony once you return to nature. It's a bit more real than that.
It's funny that you mentioned this idea of, the head gets severed and we glue it back on for the working week, because it used to be, I don't know if it still is, I hope it still is, but when you used to Google Georges Bataille, it said, because anyone else would say, I don't know, Gilles Deleuze, continental philosopher or philosopher, he used to say Georges Bataille, librarian. And I always like that idea, that they've, just tuck him away. He was just a librarian. You don't need to look into this. I always thought that was a nice glitch in Google. But that seems like a good place to finish up, I think. And once the translated monograph is published, I'll be sure to put the links in the description below, and Tim, I'll put links to your description as well, and Adam to our previous conversation. But yeah, it's been a fantastic conversation. So Tim and Adam, thanks to you both very much.
Thanks. It's a privilege to talk with two other sexy librarians about a third.